Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Miss Marple and the Widow's Knitting Circle Murder. Chapter 1. Death Among the Stitches. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of St. Mary Mead's village hall, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor where 6 ladies sat in their customary circle, needles clicking in gentle rhythm. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the intricate Fair Isle pattern she was attempting, though her keen blue eyes were more often occupied in observing her companions than in counting stitches. Thursday afternoons at 4 o'clock had become quite the institution since the formation of the Widow's Knitting Circle 6 months prior. What had begun as Mrs. Bantry's well-intentioned effort to provide companionship for the recently bereaved ladies of the village had evolved into something rather more sophisticated under the guidance of their newest member, Mrs. Violet Carmichael. Mrs. Carmichael was, Miss Marple reflected, quite the most elegant widow to have graced St. Mary Mead in many years. Somewhere in her early 60s, with silver hair arranged in perfect waves, and a wardrobe that spoke of London shops rather than village dressmakers, she had arrived from Bath with impeccable references and a charming manner that had quickly secured her acceptance into the best circles of local society. "Now then, ladies," Mrs. Carmichael was saying in her cultured voice, "remember that the tension must be absolutely even for this particular pattern. The Shetland wool is quite unforgiving of irregularities." She held up her own work, a masterpiece of intricate colour work that put the others' efforts to shame. Miss Marple nodded approvingly, though she couldn't help but notice that Mrs. Carmichael's own needles moved with a curious hesitation today. The usually confident hands seemed to falter, and twice she had dropped stitches in a most uncharacteristic manner. Mrs. Price Ridley, resplendent in purple tweed despite the warmth of the afternoon, looked up from her somewhat lopsided attempt at the pattern. "I must say, Mrs. Carmichael, this Fair Isle business is considerably more challenging than the simple scarves we were managing before your arrival. Though I suppose," she added with the faint condescension that was her particular specialty, "we must all endeavour to improve ourselves." "Quite so," murmured Miss Hartnell, whose thin fingers worked with surprising dexterity despite her 70-odd years. She had been unusually quiet today, Miss Marple observed, speaking only when directly addressed and keeping her sharp eyes fixed firmly on her knitting. Mrs. Weatherby, the youngest of their group at barely 50, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had been glancing repeatedly at the ornate knitting basket that sat beside Mrs. Carmichael's chair, though Miss Marple could not determine what about it might be causing such obvious anxiety. "The imported wool does make such a difference," Mrs. Bantry remarked cheerfully, quite oblivious to the undercurrents of tension that Miss Marple's sensitive antennae had been detecting with increasing frequency over recent weeks. "Though, I confess, I can barely manage to keep my colours from becoming dreadfully muddled." Mrs. Carmichael smiled, though Miss Marple noticed it did not quite reach her eyes. "Practice makes perfect, as they say. Though I fear I'm rather out of sorts today myself. Perhaps too much concentration on this particular piece." She gestured to the complex work in her hands, where blues and greens and soft greys created a pattern so intricate it seemed almost to tell a story. The peaceful clicking of needles continued for several minutes, broken only by the occasional request for assistance or murmur of admiration for someone's progress. Mrs. Bantry had brought her usual offering of tea and biscuits, served in the delicate china that was one of the hall's few claims to elegance. Miss Marple had just reached for her teacup, when Mrs. Carmichael's sharp intake of breath caused every head to turn. The elegant woman had gone quite pale, her knitting falling from suddenly nerveless fingers as she pressed one hand to her throat. "I say," began Mrs. Price Ridley, but her words were cut short as Mrs. Carmichael gave a small, choking gasp and collapsed forward over her beautiful work. The next few minutes passed in a blur of confusion and alarm. Mrs. Bantry rushed to support the stricken woman while Miss Hartnell hurried to the telephone to summon Dr. Haydock. Mrs. Weatherby stood frozen by her chair, and Mrs. Price Ridley issued a stream of largely unhelpful instructions from a safe distance. Miss Marple, however, moved with quiet purpose. While the others fussed and exclaimed, she observed. She noted the strange, sweet scent that seemed to hover in the air near Mrs. Carmichael's chair, quite distinct from the usual mixture of lavender water and wool. She observed that the fallen knitting had become mysteriously tangled, as though someone had deliberately twisted the strands. Most particularly, she noticed the film of some oily substance that seemed to coat the bottom of Mrs. Carmichael's teacup. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, his usually genial face grave as he knelt beside the unconscious woman. But his ministrations were in vain. Mrs. Violet Carmichael, late of Bath, teacher of Fair Isle knitting, and keeper of what Miss Marple was beginning to suspect were considerably more secrets than anyone had imagined, was quite definitively dead. "Heart, I suppose," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley with the satisfaction of one whose diagnosis had been confirmed. She did look rather peaked these last few weeks. But Dr. Haydock's expression was troubled as he rose from his examination. "I'm afraid I cannot be quite so certain, Mrs. Price Ridley. There are irregularities that concern me. I shall need to call Inspector Slack." The word irregularities fell into the hushed atmosphere of the village hall like a stone into still water. Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, noting how each of her companions reacted to this ominous pronouncement. Mrs. Bantry appeared genuinely shocked, her kind face reflecting nothing but concern and bewilderment. Mrs. Price Ridley's primary emotion seemed to be annoyance at this disruption to the natural order of things. Miss Hartnell had grown even more silent, if possible, her thin hands clenched tightly in her lap, and Mrs. Weatherby continued to cast those anxious glances toward Mrs. Carmichael's knitting basket, as though it contained something that both fascinated and terrified her. When Inspector Slack arrived with his customary brusqueness and immediately began treating the scene as one of natural death, Miss Marple quietly positioned herself where she might observe both the inspector's methods and her fellow knitters' reactions. She had learned long ago that people revealed as much by what they did not say as by their words, and the widow's knitting circle was proving to be a veritable treasure trove of unspoken communications. "Preliminary examination suggests some form of poisoning," Dr. Haydock informed the inspector in low tones, though not so quietly that Miss Marple's sharp ears could not detect the words. "Possibly something absorbed through the skin, given the symptoms I observed." Inspector Slack's expression grew considerably more serious, and he began to examine the scene with greater attention to detail. Miss Marple noticed that he seemed particularly interested in the tea service, though she wondered if he had observed the same curious residue that had caught her attention. As the official investigation proceeded, Miss Marple found herself volunteering to help sort through Mrs. Carmichael's effects, an offer that Inspector Slack accepted with his usual grudging acknowledgement of her occasional usefulness. The elegant knitting bag yielded several items that seemed curiously out of place among the usual paraphernalia of needles and wool. A small crystal vial containing what appeared to be hand cream, a letter bearing a foreign postmark that Carmichael had apparently been at some pains to conceal, and most intriguingly, a photograph of a young man in military uniform, whose face bore a striking resemblance to their recently deceased companion. Miss Marple examined each item with the careful attention she might have given to clues in one of her beloved detective novels, though she suspected that the reality of Mrs. Carmichael's death would prove considerably more complex than any fictional mystery. The threads of this particular puzzle, she reflected, were as intricately woven as the beautiful Fair Isle pattern that now lay abandoned on the floor, stained with tragedy and waiting to reveal its secrets. Before we continue, I just want to thank you for spending your evening here with me. I'm your host, Elliot, and this is Warm Pages, a quiet corner for gentle stories and restful nights. It's truly comforting how these tales connect us, no matter where we're listening from. If the story has brought you a moment of peace, feel free to leave a like. It really means a lot. And I'd love to hear where you're listening from, so don't hesitate to say hello in the comments. Now, settle in, take a sip of your tea or coffee, and let's return to the story. Chapter 2: The Poisoned Tea Service. The morning following Mrs. Carmichael's untimely demise dawned with the peculiar clarity that often follows shocking events, as though nature herself wished to illuminate the dark corners where secrets might otherwise hide. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and found herself drawn to her sitting-room window that overlooked the village hall where yesterday's tragedy had unfolded. Dr. Haydock arrived at Danemede shortly after breakfast, his usually cheerful countenance bearing the gravity of confirmed suspicions. "I'm afraid there can be no doubt about it, Miss Marple," he said, settling into the chintz armchair that had become his customary seat during their occasional consultations. Mrs. Carmichael was indeed poisoned, though by a most unusual method. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "Unusual in what respect, Doctor?" "The poison appears to be derived from exotic plant alkaloids, something quite rare and requiring considerable botanical knowledge to prepare. More significantly, it was absorbed through the skin of her fingertips. Most ingenious, really, if one can speak of murder in such terms." Dr. Haydock's professional fascination warred visibly with his natural revulsion at the crime. "Through her fingertips," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, "which suggests someone with intimate knowledge of Mrs. Carmichael's habits, her manner of working with her knitting, perhaps." "Precisely my thoughts. The poison would have been applied to something she handled regularly and for extended periods. Inspector Slack is having all her knitting materials examined, though I suspect the perpetrator was clever enough to remove the immediate source." Miss Marple considered this information while she prepared fresh tea, her movements automatic as her mind worked through the implications. "Tell me, Doctor, about the tea service yesterday. You examined it, I believe?" "Indeed I did, at your suggestion. Most illuminating, though puzzling. While all the ladies partook of tea from the same pot, using cups from the same set, Mrs. Carmichael's cup and saucer showed distinct traces of an oily residue not present on the others. However, this residue contained no trace of the poison that killed her." "How very interesting." Miss Marple's voice carried that particular tone her nephew Raymond had learned to associate with the unravelling of particularly complex puzzles. A red herring, perhaps, or possibly a second attempt that failed. Dr. Haydock looked startled. "Good heavens, Miss Marple, you don't suppose someone tried twice?" "I think, Doctor, that we are dealing with someone of considerable cunning, who wished to ensure success while also deflecting suspicion from the actual method employed." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose expression suggested a morning spent in frustrating interviews. He accepted Miss Marple's offer of tea with uncharacteristic gratitude, settling his bulk into the remaining chair with a sigh that spoke volumes about his current state of mind. "Most peculiar business, this," he began without preamble. "Questioned all the knitting circle ladies this morning, and if I didn't know better, I'd say they were all hiding something. Not necessarily connected to the murder, mind you, but something." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. People often conceal the most innocent matters when confronted with official inquiry, Inspector. What did you learn of Mrs. Carmichael's recent behaviour? According to Mrs. Bantry, she'd been acting strangely these past few weeks, arriving late to meetings, seeming distracted, asking odd questions about the other ladies' families and backgrounds. Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned that she'd been receiving mail from abroad, though she was quite secretive about it. And the others? Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with obvious irritation. Miss Hartnell claimed everything seemed perfectly normal, though she was unusually terse in her responses. Mrs. Weatherby appeared distinctly nervous, kept wringing her hands and glancing about as though expecting something unpleasant to materialize. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. Inspector, have you had opportunity to examine Mrs. Carmichael's cottage? Rosemary Lodge. Yes, this morning. Oddest thing, Miss Marple. The woman lived like a duchess, everything perfectly arranged, expensive furnishings throughout. But her study looked as though it had been ransacked, drawers pulled out, papers scattered. Either she was searching for something herself, or someone else was. And what did you discover among her papers? Inspector Slack's expression grew grimmer. Correspondence with a private investigator in London, fellow named Pemberton. Seems Mrs. Carmichael had engaged his services to research the backgrounds of various St. Mary Mead residents, most particularly the ladies of her knitting circle. Dr. Haydock set down his teacup with enough force to rattle the saucer. Good Lord! You mean she was investigating her fellow knitters? Appears so, Doctor. And that's not the most interesting discovery. Mrs. Carmichael's real name wasn't Violet Carmichael at all. According to her private papers, she was Victoria Ashworth, and she'd been using various assumed identities for the better part of 20 years. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the calm attention she might have given to news of the weather, though her blue eyes had acquired that particularly sharp focus that those who knew her best had learned to respect. Victoria Ashworth, she repeated softly. Tell me, Inspector, did you discover anything about why she might have chosen to investigate these particular ladies? Nothing definitive, but there were references to wartime service, something about a relief office. All very fragmentary, as though the important documents had been removed. Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk, returning with a small notebook in which she occasionally recorded her observations of village life. Inspector, you mentioned Mrs. Carmichael had been asking questions about the other ladies' backgrounds. What sort of questions? Mrs. Bantry mentioned that she'd been particularly interested in their wartime activities, where they'd worked, what organizations they'd been involved with. Seemed innocent enough at the time, the sort of conversation one might expect among new acquaintances. But viewed in light of subsequent events, Miss Marple observed, it takes on a rather different complexion. Inspector Slack nodded glumly. Precisely. And there's something else, Miss Marple. Found a hidden compartment in her bedroom, behind a loose floorboard. Contained another knitting basket. This one with a half-finished piece that doesn't look like any pattern I've ever seen. Miss Marple's interest sharpened visibly. Might I examine this piece, Inspector? Don't see why not, considering your help yesterday. It's at the station now, being photographed for evidence. Strange thing, though. It looks almost like writing, the way the stitches are arranged. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional curiosity. Do you think it might be some sort of code? Wouldn't surprise me, given what else we've discovered about the lady. Victoria Ashworth appears to have been a woman with considerably more secrets than anyone in St. Mary Mead suspected. Miss Marple was quiet for several moments, her fingers absently working the knitting that was never far from her hands. Finally, she looked up with that gentle smile that had preceded the solution of many mysteries in their peaceful village. Inspector, I believe we may be dealing with a case that extends far beyond our little community. If Mrs. Ashworth was indeed investigating the wartime activities of her fellow knitters, and if someone was sufficiently concerned about her discoveries to commit murder, then we must consider the possibility that these activities were not entirely above reproach. Inspector Slack's expression grew even more troubled. You mean these respectable village ladies might have been involved in something criminal? I mean, Inspector, that war creates opportunities for both heroism and corruption, and that secrets buried for decades have a most unfortunate tendency to surface at the most inconvenient moments. I suspect that Mrs. Ashworth's return to St. Mary Mead, under her assumed identity, was no coincidence. She came here with a purpose, and someone was determined to prevent her from achieving it. The three sat in contemplative silence, each lost in consideration of the implications. Outside, St. Mary Mead continued its peaceful existence, unaware that beneath its tranquil surface a web of deception spanning decades was slowly beginning to unravel. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Sewing Basket. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the police station's modest evidence room as Miss Marple examined the curious knitting pattern that had occupied Victoria Ashworth's secret hours. What had appeared to Inspector Slack as merely an eccentric arrangement of stitches revealed itself, to Miss Marple's experienced eye, as something far more deliberate and sinister. You see, Inspector, she explained, her voice carrying that patient tone she employed when unravelling particularly complex village tangles, the pattern follows no traditional design. Instead, it appears to incorporate initials worked into the fabric itself. Here, for instance, is what I believe to be PR. Mrs. Price Ridley, perhaps, followed by a series of numbers that might well represent dates. Inspector Slack peered at the work with considerable scepticism. If you say so, Miss Marple, though it looks like a muddle of coloured wool to me. Miss Marple's fingers traced the intricate stitches with gentle precision. Not a muddle, Inspector, but a record. See here. H, followed by what appears to be 1943, and then a series of smaller symbols. And here, W coupled with numbers that might represent monetary sums. Dr. Haydock, who had joined them for this examination, leaned closer with professional interest. Good heavens, Miss Marple, you're suggesting she was keeping some sort of coded record in her knitting? Indeed, Doctor, rather like Mrs. Henderson's method of recording her bridge scores in her needlework, though considerably more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous to the parties concerned. The comparison to the late Mrs. Henderson, whose passion for both bridge and embroidery had resulted in some memorable village controversies, was typical of Miss Marple's method of illuminating present mysteries through past experiences. Inspector Slack had learned to pay attention when she began drawing such parallels. Dangerous in what sense, he inquired, though his expression suggested he was beginning to anticipate the answer. Miss Marple set down the knitting with careful deliberation. I spent the morning making certain inquiries, Inspector, of the sort that often prove illuminating in matters of this nature. It appears that all the members of our knitting circle were indeed connected during the war years, though none mentioned this association during yesterday's interviews. Connected how? They all worked, at various times and in various capacities, at the local War Relief Office. The office was established in 1942 to coordinate charitable efforts for war widows and orphans, and it handled quite substantial sums of money before being disbanded in 1946. Inspector Slack's expression grew considerably more attentive. And you think Mrs. Ashworth discovered something about their wartime activities? Miss Marple nodded gravely. I think, Inspector, that Victoria Ashworth spent considerable time and effort uncovering irregularities in the War Relief Office accounts, irregularities that her fellow knitting circle members had every reason to wish remained buried. Dr. Haydock looked startled. You mean they were stealing from war widows? I mean, Doctor, that war creates opportunities for both nobility and corruption, and that people who appear perfectly respectable in peacetime may behave quite differently when faced with large sums of unguarded money and minimal oversight. Inspector Slack was already reaching for his telephone. I'll contact the War Office Records Department immediately. If there were irregularities, there should be some trace. While the inspector made his inquiries, Miss Marple continued her examination of the coded knitting. The pattern was indeed ingenious, she reflected, incorporating what appeared to be a comprehensive record of financial discrepancies spanning several years. Victoria Ashworth had clearly possessed both considerable skill in cryptography and unlimited patience in her pursuit of justice. The telephone conversation revealed, as Miss Marple had anticipated, that the War Relief Office records showed significant discrepancies in their final accounting. Funds that should have been distributed to deserving families had simply vanished, and the investigation into these irregularities had been halted abruptly following the sudden death of the officer conducting the inquiry. "Colonel Ashworth," Inspector Slack announced, replacing the receiver with considerable emphasis. "Victoria Ashworth's father died of a heart attack in 1946, just as he was preparing to submit his final report on the missing funds." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her blue eyes had acquired that particularly sharp focus that her nephew Raymond had learned to associate with moments of significant revelation. How very convenient for those whose activities he was investigating. Dr. Haydock looked troubled. "Surely you're not suggesting that Colonel Ashworth was murdered as well?" "I am suggesting, Doctor, that convenient deaths and missing evidence often form patterns that extend across decades. Victoria Ashworth may have spent 20 years preparing to complete her father's investigation, only to discover that the perpetrators were still alive, still prosperous, and still quite capable of defending their secrets." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with obvious frustration. "But which of them? Mrs. Price Ridley? Miss Hartnell? Mrs. Weatherby? They all had access to the funds. All could have manipulated the accounts." Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, where she stood gazing out at the peaceful village street with an expression of profound thoughtfulness. When she spoke, her voice carried that gentle certainty that those who knew her had learned to respect. "Inspector, I believe we must consider not just who had access to the funds, but who had the knowledge and opportunity to prepare the exotic poison that killed Victoria Ashworth." Dr. Haydock mentioned that it required considerable botanical expertise to create such a substance. "You think one of the knitting circle ladies is a poisoner?" Dr. Haydock's voice carried obvious disbelief. "I think, Doctor, that wartime service often involved acquiring unusual skills, and that someone with medical training would have both the knowledge to prepare such a poison and the means to administer it without detection." Inspector Slack looked up sharply from his notes. "Medical training? Miss Hartnell was a nurse during the war, worked at the military hospital before joining the relief office." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Indeed, Inspector, and nursing during wartime would have provided exposure to a wide variety of medicinal plants and their properties, both beneficial and deadly." The afternoon was wearing on, and the shadows in the evidence room had grown longer as the three contemplated the implications of their discoveries. Miss Marple's careful analysis of the coded knitting had revealed not just a record of financial irregularities, but what appeared to be a comprehensive indictment of a conspiracy that had enriched its participants at the expense of those most deserving of charity. "There's something else," Miss Marple said quietly, returning to examine the knitting once more. "The pattern includes references to dates in the immediate future. I believe Victoria Ashworth was planning some sort of revelation, possibly timed to coincide with the anniversary of her father's death." Inspector Slack consulted his calendar. "That would be next week, Miss Marple." "Precisely, Inspector, which suggests that her murder was not simply a matter of protecting old secrets, but of preventing an imminent exposure that would have brought the entire conspiracy to light." Dr. Haydock shook his head in amazement. To think that such things could happen in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's smile held a trace of sadness. Human nature, Doctor, remains remarkably consistent regardless of location. Greed, fear, and the desire for respectability can drive people to extraordinary lengths, even in the most peaceful of villages. As they prepared to leave the police station, Miss Marple paused to examine once more the intricate pattern that Victoria Ashworth had created in her final weeks. A dead woman's dedication to uncovering the truth had been absolute, her method ingenious, and her courage considerable. It remained to be seen whether justice, so long delayed, might finally be served. Chapter 4. The Mysterious Pattern. The following morning brought with it one of those crisp, clear days that seem particularly conducive to the unravelling of mysteries. Though Miss Marple had long ago observed that truth has a tendency to emerge regardless of meteorological conditions, she had risen early, as was her custom, and devoted the hours before breakfast to a most illuminating correspondence with her nephew Raymond, whose connections in London had proved invaluable in securing the services of a gentleman well versed in the arcane art of cryptography. Mr. Fielding arrived on the 10:15 train, a thin, scholarly gentleman whose appearance suggested equal familiarity with ancient manuscripts and modern puzzles. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room, where Victoria Ashworth's coded knitting had been arranged with a careful attention one might accord a museum piece. "Most extraordinary," Mr. Fielding murmured, adjusting his spectacles as he examined the intricate pattern through a magnifying glass. "I've encountered various methods of concealing information, Miss Marple, but never one quite so ingenious as this." The lady possessed considerable skill in both needlework and cryptography. Miss Marple poured tea with her customary precision, her movements betraying none of the anticipation she felt regarding Mr. Fielding's analysis. "You are able to decipher the pattern, then?" Indeed, though it required several hours of careful study, the system is based upon a combination of color sequences and stitch variations, with each element corresponding to specific letters or numbers. Rather like Mrs. Pemberton's method of recording her household accounts in her embroidery samplers, though infinitely more sophisticated. The reference to Mrs. Pemberton, whose creative accounting methods had provided considerable entertainment for the village some years prior, was precisely the sort of parallel that Miss Marple found both illuminating and reassuring. Human ingenuity, she had long observed, tended to follow remarkably consistent patterns. Mr. Fielding produced a neat typescript from his briefcase. "The decoded message is quite comprehensive, Miss Marple. It details a systematic conspiracy involving the misappropriation of funds intended for war widows and orphans, spanning the years 1943 to 1946. The amounts involved are substantial, and the method employed was both clever and callous." Miss Marple accepted the document with the calm attention she might have devoted to the morning's correspondence, though her blue eyes acquired that particularly keen focus that those who knew her had learned to associate with moments of significant revelation. "The conspiracy," she read aloud, "involved the creation of fictitious beneficiaries, the inflation of legitimate claims, and the direct theft of funds through manipulated accounting. The perpetrators used their positions of trust to systematically defraud charitable contributions meant for the most vulnerable members of society." Mr. Fielding nodded gravely. The document also contains references to what Mrs. Ashworth termed a final accounting, scheduled to coincide with a specific date of apparent significance to her investigation. Miss Marple consulted the calendar that sat upon her writing desk. "The anniversary of her father's death, I believe. Colonel Ashworth died on the 15th of this month, exactly 29 years ago." "Which would be next Thursday," Mr. Fielding observed, "the same day as your knitting circle meeting." The implications of this timing were not lost upon Miss Marple, who had long ago learned to distrust coincidences, particularly those involving such precise symbolic significance. Victoria Ashworth had clearly planned her revelation with the theatrical flair of someone determined to ensure maximum impact. After Mr. Fielding's departure, Miss Marple devoted considerable thought to the question of how best to proceed with this new information. Inspector Slack would need to be informed, naturally, but she suspected that the official investigation might benefit from certain preliminary inquiries of a more delicate nature. Her first visit was to the village archives, housed in the basement of the town hall, where Mrs. Jameson presided over decades of carefully preserved records with the dedication of a devoted custodian. The elderly archivist proved most helpful in locating the War Relief Office files, though what they revealed was both illuminating and disturbing. The records show quite substantial discrepancies, Mrs. Jameson explained, her voice carrying that tone of professional disapproval reserved for instances of poor record-keeping. The final accounting was never completed due to Colonel Ashworth's sudden death, and the office was disbanded shortly thereafter, with many questions left unanswered. Miss Marple examined the surviving documents with careful attention, noting the names of those who had served in various capacities at the Relief Office. All the current members of the knitting circle were indeed listed, though their specific responsibilities varied considerably. Mrs. Price Ridley had served as treasurer, a position that would have provided extensive access to the office's financial records. Miss Hartnell had been employed as both a nurse and administrative assistant, giving her knowledge of both medical matters and accounting procedures. Mrs. Weatherby had worked as a clerk, handling correspondence and maintaining beneficiary records. Most significantly, the records showed that Colonel Ashworth had been conducting his investigation with the assistance of a young officer, whose sudden transfer to overseas duty had effectively ended the inquiry. The officer's final report, which should have been contained in the files, was notably absent. Miss Marple's next destination was the cottage that had belonged to Dr. Morrison, the physician who had attended Colonel Ashworth during his final illness. Dr. Morrison had long since passed away, but his widow remained, a lady of advanced years whose memory of the events surrounding the Colonel's death proved remarkably clear. Such a sudden thing, Mrs. Morrison recalled, settling into her chair with the careful movements of one whose joints had grown stiff with age. The Colonel had been in excellent health, quite vigorous for a man of his years. Dr. Morrison was most puzzled by the rapidity of his decline. Miss Marple accepted the offered tea and settled into the familiar rhythm of village conversation, allowing Mrs. Morrison's memories to flow at their natural pace. There were aspects of the case that troubled my husband considerably, the elderly lady continued. The symptoms were consistent with heart failure, certainly, but there were irregularities that he found difficult to explain. He mentioned it several times, though he never spoke of it publicly. What sort of irregularities, Mrs. Morrison? The pupils of the eyes, the condition of the fingernails, certain aspects of the final moments that suggested— Well, my husband never said directly, but I believe he suspected that Colonel Ashworth's death might not have been entirely natural. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the calm attention she brought to all significant revelations, though her mind was already working through the implications. If Colonel Ashworth had indeed been murdered, then Victoria's own death represented not the beginning of this tragedy, but its completion 29 years later. The afternoon was well advanced when Miss Marple finally returned to Danemead, her mind occupied with the complex pattern of deception and murder that was slowly revealing itself. Victoria Ashworth had indeed uncovered a conspiracy of considerable scope and duration, one that had already claimed at least 2 lives, and showed every indication of claiming more if not stopped. The encoded knitting pattern had proved to be far more than a simple record of financial irregularities. It was, Miss Marple realized, a carefully constructed indictment that named names, detailed methods, and provided sufficient evidence to ensure that justice, so long delayed, might finally be served. The question that remained was whether the surviving conspirators would allow such justice to proceed unchallenged. Chapter 5. Whispers at the Church Hall. The memorial service for Mrs. Violet Carmichael was arranged with that particular blend of haste and propriety that characterizes village responses to sudden death. Miss Marple, observing the preparations from her position near the church hall entrance, reflected that such occasions often revealed as much about the living as they purported to honour the dead. The Reverend Clement had outdone himself in preparing suitable remarks about a woman he had barely known, though Miss Marple noted with interest that his eulogy focused primarily upon Mrs. Carmichael's contributions to the knitting circle, rather than upon any deeper spiritual or personal qualities. It was, she mused, rather like praising someone for their skill at cards, without mentioning whether they played honestly. The attendance was respectable, if not overwhelming, consisting primarily of those village residents who considered it their duty to appear at all such occasions, regardless of their actual acquaintance with the deceased. Miss Marple positioned herself where she might observe not only the service itself, but the subtle interactions between the surviving members of the knitting circle. Mrs. Bantry had arrived early and taken a seat in the third pew, her kind face reflecting genuine sorrow at the loss of what she had clearly considered a friendship. Mrs. Price Ridley, resplendent in black silk that spoke more of fashion than mourning, occupied her customary position near the front, where her presence might be properly noted by all concerned. Miss Hartnell sat alone in the fourth pew, her thin frame rigid with what might have been grief or might equally have been tension. She had spoken to no one upon arrival, merely nodded stiffly to those who offered condolences before taking her seat with the precise movements of someone determined to attract no unnecessary attention. Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple observed, appeared distinctly unwell. Her usually neat appearance showed signs of hasty preparation, and her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages of her prayer book. Most significantly, she kept glancing toward the other knitting circle members with an expression that suggested considerable anxiety about their reactions to the proceedings. The Reverend Clement's eulogy proceeded along predictable lines, touching upon Mrs. Carmichael's apparent dedication to charitable works and her skill in teaching the intricate patterns that had so improved the circle's collective abilities. When he spoke of her dedication to uncovering truth in all its forms, Miss Marple noticed a distinct stiffening among several members of the congregation, particularly Miss Hartnell and Mrs. Weatherby. The exchange of glances between these two ladies was so swift and meaningful that it might have escaped notice from any observer less practiced in the subtle communications that characterize village gatherings. Miss Marple, however, had spent decades learning to read such silent conversations, and what she observed suggested a level of understanding between the two women that went far beyond their casual acquaintance within the knitting circle. Following the service, the usual gathering in the church hall provided opportunities for the sort of informal conversation that often proves more illuminating than formal interviews. Miss Marple, armed with her customary teacup and positioned near the memorial flowers, found herself ideally situated to observe the various social currents that flowed through the assembled mourners. Mrs. Bantry approached her with obvious distress. "Such a tragedy, Jane, and so sudden. I can't help but feel that we barely knew her despite all our Thursday afternoons together." Miss Marple's response was characteristically gentle. "People often take considerable time to reveal their true selves, Dolly, though I suspect Mrs. Carmichael was perhaps more forthcoming than we realized, in her own way." It was while helping to clear the tea things that Miss Marple found herself in position to overhear the whispered conversation between Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell that proved so enlightening. The two women had withdrawn to a corner near the kitchen door, apparently believing themselves unobserved. "The whole business is most unfortunate," Mrs. Price Ridley was saying in the low tone she reserved for matters of particular delicacy. "One can only hope that certain matters will be allowed to rest peacefully." Miss Hartnell's response was even more subdued. "We must simply trust that discretion will prevail. After all, some secrets are best left undisturbed, particularly when their revelation would serve no useful purpose." "Indeed," Mrs. Price Ridley agreed. though one cannot help but wonder what she might have told others before the end. Miss Marple, arranging teacups with careful precision, noted that both women appeared considerably more concerned about potential revelations than about the loss of their knitting companion. Their conversation continued in fragments, references to keeping quiet and what was best for everyone concerned, that suggested a level of coordination that went well beyond normal social courtesy. The most revealing moment came when Mrs. Weatherby approached the pair, her face pale and her manner distinctly agitated. "I simply cannot bear this uncertainty," she whispered urgently. "Surely we should discuss what needs to be done." Mrs. Price Ridley's response was swift and decisive. "Not here, Edith. There are too many ears and some matters require privacy." Miss Hartnell nodded agreement. "Perhaps tomorrow afternoon at my cottage. We can review the situation properly then." The arrangement of this private meeting, conducted in whispers but nonetheless audible to Miss Marple's practised ears, confirmed her growing suspicion that the surviving knitting circle members were indeed concealing information relevant to Mrs. Carmichael's death. Their obvious anxiety about potential revelations suggested that Victoria Ashworth's investigation had uncovered matters that went well beyond simple financial irregularities. As the memorial gathering drew to a close, Miss Marple made her way to the church secretary's office, where Mrs. Dane maintained the parish records with the meticulous care that such documents deserved. The elderly secretary proved most helpful in discussing Mrs. Carmichael's recent visits to examine the church archives. "Such a thorough researcher," Mrs. Dane commented approvingly. "She spent hours going through our memorial records, particularly those from the war years. Seemed especially interested in the donation records from that period." Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. "Donation records?" "Yes, the substantial anonymous contributions that helped fund our memorial window and the repairs to the bell tower. Quite generous donations they were, though the donors preferred to remain unnamed. Mrs. Carmichael seemed particularly interested in the timing of these gifts." The implications of this information were not lost upon Miss Marple. If the anonymous donations had originated from funds stolen from the War Relief Office, then Victoria Ashworth had indeed uncovered evidence that could have exposed the entire conspiracy. The church records would have provided concrete proof of the stolen money's ultimate destination. As Miss Marple walked home through the quiet village streets, her mind worked through the complex pattern of deception that was slowly revealing itself. Victoria Ashworth had spent months, perhaps years, carefully gathering evidence of a wartime conspiracy that had enriched its participants at the expense of those most deserving of charity. Her infiltration of the knitting circle had been a calculated move designed to observe her suspects at close quarters while maintaining the appearance of innocent social interaction. The memorial service had revealed that the surviving conspirators were well aware of the threat she had posed and were actively coordinating their response to her death. Their whispered conversations and hurried arrangements for private meetings suggested that they believed themselves still in danger of exposure, despite Victoria's elimination. Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, struck by a sudden realization that sent a chill through her usually unflappable composure. If the conspirators were indeed planning to eliminate all potential witnesses to their crimes, then the surviving knitting circle members were not merely suspects in Victoria's murder. They were also potential victims of whoever among them possessed both the knowledge and the ruthlessness necessary to commit murder in defense of decades-old secrets. Chapter 6. The Colonel's Hidden Past. The morning following the memorial service dawned with that peculiar clarity that often accompanies moments of significant revelation, as though nature herself wished to illuminate the shadows where truth might otherwise remain concealed. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night contemplating the implications of the whispered conversations she had overheard, rose early and devoted her attention to correspondence that had arrived by the first post. The letter bore the impressive letterhead of the War Office, and its contents proved most illuminating regarding the character and circumstances of the late Colonel Ashworth. The responding official, a Mr. Pemberton Smith, whose courteous efficiency suggested long experience in such matters, had provided a comprehensive summary of the Colonel's distinguished service record and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his final investigation. Colonel Ashworth had indeed been a man of impeccable reputation, his military career spanning 3 decades and encompassing service in various challenging postings, where his attention to detail and unwavering integrity had earned considerable respect from both superiors and subordinates. His appointment to investigate the War Relief Office irregularities had been a natural consequence of these qualities, though the investigation itself had proved far more complex than initially anticipated. The Colonel's preliminary reports, copies of which Mr. Pemberton Smith had thoughtfully enclosed, revealed a systematic pattern of fraud that extended far beyond simple accounting errors. The missing funds had been diverted through a network of fictitious beneficiaries and inflated claims, with the stolen money subsequently invested in property and securities that continued to provide income long after the original theft. Most significantly, the Colonel's final report had identified specific individuals involved in the conspiracy, though the document itself had vanished following his sudden death. The investigation had been officially suspended and the War Relief Office disbanded, with the recommendation that the matter be allowed to rest in the interests of maintaining public confidence in charitable institutions. Miss Marple set down the correspondence with that careful precision she brought to all significant documents, her mind already working through the implications of what she had learned. Colonel Ashworth had clearly been eliminated because his investigation threatened to expose not just the original theft, but the ongoing benefits that the conspirators continued to derive from their crimes. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose expression suggested a morning spent in similarly illuminating research. He accepted her offer of tea with the grateful manner of one whose official duties had begun considerably earlier than was customary. "Most interesting developments, Miss Marple," he began, without his usual preliminaries. "Received word from London this morning about Victoria Ashworth's activities during the past 20 years. The woman was quite the detective, it seems, though she operated outside official channels." Miss Marple poured tea with her customary attention to proper proportions. "In what sense, Inspector?" She'd been using various identities to investigate her father's death and the circumstances surrounding the War Relief Office scandal. Appears she spent years gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, tracking down financial records that should have been destroyed decades ago. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with obvious satisfaction. According to the London investigator she employed, Mrs. Ashworth had compiled a comprehensive case against the surviving conspirators. The evidence was sufficient to support both criminal charges and civil proceedings to recover the stolen funds. Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. "And this evidence?" "That's the peculiar thing, Miss Marple. The investigator, a fellow named Pemberton, claims the complete file was to be delivered to Scotland Yard on the day following Mrs. Ashworth's death. The package never arrived, and all traces of the evidence had vanished." The implications of this information were not lost upon Miss Marple, who had long ago learned to recognize the patterns that characterized systematic cover-ups. Victoria Ashworth's murder had been timed with precision to prevent the delivery of evidence that would have exposed the entire conspiracy. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we must consider the possibility that Mrs. Ashworth's death was not merely about concealing past crimes, but about preventing the recovery of stolen funds that had been generating income for the conspirators for nearly 30 years. Inspector Slack's expression grew grimmer. "You mean they've been living off the proceeds all this time?" "I mean, Inspector, that people who steal from war widows are unlikely to suffer attacks of conscience with the passage of time. The money that should have supported the most vulnerable members of society has instead been providing comfort and security for those who betrayed their trust." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, whose usually cheerful demeanour bore signs of considerable disturbance. He accepted tea with absent-minded gratitude, his attention clearly occupied by matters of professional concern. "Most disturbing news about Colonel Ashworth's death," he announced without preamble. "Spoke with Dr. Morrison's nephew this morning. young fellow who's taken over the practice. He mentioned that his uncle had preserved certain private notes about cases that had troubled him professionally. Miss Marple's attention focused with that particular intensity she brought to significant revelations. What sort of notes, Doctor? Detailed observations about Colonel Ashworth's final illness, including symptoms that were inconsistent with natural heart failure. Dr. Morrison suspected poisoning, though he lacked the means to prove it at the time. Dr. Haydock produced a small notebook from his medical bag. The symptoms Morrison recorded are consistent with alkaloid poisoning, probably from the same family of plant toxins that killed Victoria Ashworth. The method was different, but the basic approach appears identical. Inspector Slack leaned forward with obvious interest. You're saying the same person killed both father and daughter, 29 years apart. I'm saying the evidence suggests a pattern of elimination that spans decades, Inspector. Someone with access to exotic poisons and the knowledge to use them effectively has been silencing threats to the War Relief Office conspiracy for a very long time. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the calm attention she brought to all significant developments, though her mind was already working through the implications. The systematic nature of the murders suggested not only careful planning, but considerable confidence in the ability to evade detection. Dr. Haydock, she said quietly, the exotic poisons you mentioned, would they require specialized knowledge to cultivate and prepare? Absolutely, Miss Marple. We're dealing with someone who possesses both botanical expertise and medical knowledge, probably gained through professional training or extensive personal study. The afternoon was well advanced when Miss Marple finally found herself alone with her thoughts, contemplating the complex pattern of deception and murder that was slowly revealing itself. Colonel Ashworth's investigation had uncovered a conspiracy of considerable scope, one that continued to threaten exposure even decades after the original crimes. Victoria Ashworth had inherited not just her father's files, but his dedication to justice and his unwillingness to allow crimes against the innocent to remain unpunished. Her patient investigation had recreated the evidence that had been destroyed following her father's death, and her infiltration of the knitting circle had brought her within reach of final proof. The conspirators, however, had proven equally patient and far more ruthless. Their elimination of both father and daughter demonstrated a commitment to protecting their secrets that knew no bounds of conscience or decency. The question that remained was whether their confidence in their ability to evade justice was justified, or whether Miss Marple's own patient investigation might finally bring them to account for crimes that had been hidden for far too long. Chapter 7. A Deadly Yarn. Miss Marple's plan, conceived during the quiet hours before dawn when the mind often achieves its greatest clarity, was executed with the careful precision that had characterized her approach to village mysteries for more years than she cared to count. The announcement, delivered with apparent casualness during her morning rounds, that she had discovered Mrs. Carmichael's complete evidence file, created precisely the ripples of anxiety she had anticipated. The news, carefully disseminated through the reliable channels of village communication, reached each member of the surviving knitting circle by noon. Miss Marple's statement that she intended to deliver the file to Inspector Slack the following morning was calculated to produce that sense of urgency which often compels individuals to reveal their true nature. Mrs. Price Ridley was the first to respond, arriving at Danemead with the determined bearing of one accustomed to managing inconvenient situations through sheer force of personality. Her offer to assist in reviewing the evidence was couched in terms of civic duty, though her underlying anxiety was evident in the nervous adjustment of her gloves and the careful precision with which she chose her words. One cannot be too careful with such matters, she observed, settling into the chintz armchair with the air of one prepared for a lengthy discussion. Poor Mrs. Carmichael was, I fear, rather inclined to romantic imaginings. It would be most unfortunate if baseless accusations were to disturb the peace of our community. Miss Marple's response was delivered with that gentle firmness which those who knew her had learned to recognize as immovable determination. I'm quite certain that Inspector Slack will be able to distinguish between fact and fancy, Mrs. Price Ridley, though I must say The documentation appears remarkably thorough. The visible effect of this observation upon Mrs. Price Ridley's composure was most instructive. Her usual confidence wavered perceptibly, replaced by an expression of barely concealed alarm that spoke volumes about her awareness of what Victoria Ashworth might have discovered. Miss Hartnell's visit followed a different pattern entirely. Her approach was characterized by that particular form of aggressive dismissal that often masks profound unease. Her attempts to discredit Victoria's mental stability were delivered with the sharp precision of one skilled in character assassination, though her underlying desperation was evident in the excessive vehemence of her denunciations. The woman was clearly unbalanced, she declared with the authority of one pronouncing medical judgment. Her recent behaviour had become quite erratic, asking the most peculiar questions, making wild accusations. Really, Miss Marple, I fear that any so-called evidence she may have compiled would be the product of a disturbed imagination rather than factual investigation. Miss Marple's patient attention to these protestations revealed their defensive nature, though she offered no direct challenge to Miss Hartnell's assertions. Instead, she employed that technique of gentle questioning which had proved so effective in previous investigations, allowing her visitor to reveal more than she intended through her very eagerness to convince. Mrs. Weatherby's response proved the most illuminating of all. Her arrival at Daymead was preceded by a telephone call, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion as she begged for a private interview on a matter of utmost urgency. When she appeared at the front door, her usual neat appearance showed signs of considerable distress, and her hands shook visibly as she accepted the offered chair. "I cannot bear this uncertainty any longer," she confessed, abandoning any pretense of composure. Mrs. Carmichael had been asking such pointed questions about the war years, about the relief office, about things that are better left forgotten. I fear she may have uncovered information that could cause considerable embarrassment to entirely innocent people. Miss Marple's gentle encouragement proved sufficient to unlock a flood of revelations. Mrs. Weatherby's confession, delivered in fragments punctuated by tears and protestations of innocence, painted a picture of systematic fraud, orchestrated by individuals who had used their positions of trust to enrich themselves at the expense of those most deserving of charitable assistance. "It wasn't meant to be permanent," Mrs. Weatherby insisted, her voice carrying the desperation of one seeking absolution for long-concealed sins. "The amounts were small at first, and we told ourselves it was merely borrowing, that we would repay everything once our own circumstances improved. But then the war ended, and the office was disbanded, and somehow the opportunity to make restitution never arose." The admission, partial though it was, confirmed Miss Marple's growing understanding of the conspiracy's scope and duration. The theft had indeed been systematic and deliberate, disguised as administrative errors, but actually representing a calculated betrayal of charitable trust that had continued to benefit its perpetrators for decades. Mrs. Weatherby's revelations also provided insight into the dynamics that had governed the conspiracy. Mrs. Price Ridley had apparently served as the organizing intelligence, using her position as treasurer to manipulate the accounts and coordinate the fraudulent activities. Miss Hartnell had provided medical expertise and administrative support, while Mrs. Weatherby herself had maintained the fictitious records that concealed the theft. Most significantly, Mrs. Weatherby's confession revealed that Colonel Ashworth's investigation had indeed identified the specific individuals involved in the conspiracy. His preliminary reports had named names and detailed methods, creating an existential threat to the conspirators' continued freedom and prosperity. "The Colonel was so thorough," Mrs. Weatherby recalled with evident distress. "He seemed to know everything, to have uncovered every irregularity. We were all terrified of what would happen when his final report was submitted." Miss Marple's careful questioning elicited the crucial admission that Colonel Ashworth's death had been viewed by the conspirators not as a tragedy, but as divine intervention that had saved them from exposure and disgrace. The speed with which they had moved to destroy evidence and discredit his preliminary findings suggested coordination that went well beyond panic-driven improvisation. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple found herself in possession of a comprehensive understanding of both the original conspiracy and its long-term consequences. The stolen funds had indeed been invested wisely, providing decades of comfort and security for individuals who had betrayed the trust of their community and nation. Victoria Ashworth's patient investigation had recreated the evidence that had been destroyed following her father's death, and her infiltration of the knitting circle had brought her within reach of final proof. Her systematic gathering of information about each conspirator's current circumstances had been preparation for a comprehensive exposure that would have resulted in both criminal prosecution and financial ruin. The evening brought a final visitor, though one whose arrival Miss Marple had anticipated with considerable interest. Inspector Slack appeared at her door with an expression of grim satisfaction, bearing news that confirmed her growing suspicions about the immediate danger facing those who possessed knowledge of the conspiracy. "Anonymous letter," he announced, producing a single sheet of paper, bearing a message composed of words cut from newspapers, warning you to abandon your investigation or face the same fate as Mrs. Carmichael. Posted locally this afternoon, which suggests our murderer is feeling considerably pressured by recent developments. Miss Marple examined the threatening communication with the calm attention she might have devoted to the morning's correspondence, though her mind was already working through the implications of this latest development. The killer's desperation was evident in the crude methodology and obvious urgency of the warning, suggesting that her strategy of applying pressure was achieving its intended effect. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we are approaching the moment when our murderer will be compelled to act decisively. The threat of exposure has become intolerable, and desperation often leads to mistakes that reveal more than careful planning ever intended." Chapter 8. The Final Stitch. The village hall on Thursday afternoon possessed that particular quality of expectancy that often precedes moments of profound revelation, as though the very walls retained memories of the tragedy that had unfolded within them 1 week prior. Miss Marple arrived early, as was her custom, arranging the chairs in their familiar circle with the methodical precision that had characterized her approach to this most delicate of investigations. Inspector Slack had positioned himself with admirable discretion behind the kitchen partition, from where he might observe the proceedings without alerting the participants to official scrutiny. His presence, though concealed, provided Miss Marple with the reassurance that justice might swiftly follow upon the heels of revelation. The surviving members of the knitting circle arrived with punctuality that spoke more of anxiety than courtesy. Mrs. Bantry appeared genuinely pleased by the opportunity to complete what she termed poor Mrs. Carmichael's final project, though Miss Marple observed that her companions seemed considerably less enthusiastic about this memorial endeavour. Mrs. Price Ridley entered with her customary air of authority, though careful observation revealed subtle signs of strain in the precise arrangement of her features and the measured control of her movements. Miss Hartnell followed shortly thereafter, her thin frame rigid with tension that seemed to emanate from some inner turmoil. Mrs. Weatherby was the last to arrive, her pale countenance and trembling hands bearing witness to a sleepless night spent in contemplation of consequences. Miss Marple had prepared with considerable care for this final gathering, arranging upon the central table not only the customary tea service, but also several manila envelopes that contained what she had led each participant believe were copies of Victoria Ashworth's incriminating evidence. The psychological effect of these innocent-looking documents was immediate and revealing. "How thoughtful of you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price Ridley observed with strained pleasantry, "to arrange this memorial completion of poor Mrs. Carmichael's work. Though I must say, I find myself wondering about those papers you mentioned yesterday." Miss Marple's response carried that gentle firmness which those familiar with her methods had learned to recognize as implacable determination. "Indeed, Mrs. Price Ridley, I thought it appropriate that each of you should have the opportunity to examine what Mrs. Carmichael discovered about your individual contributions to the war effort. Such dedicated service deserves proper recognition." The distribution of the envelopes proceeded with ceremonial deliberation, each recipient accepting a portion, with expressions that ranged from barely concealed alarm to desperate curiosity. Miss Marple observed with professional interest the varied reactions as each woman examined the contents of her particular packet. Mrs. Price Ridley's envelope contained detailed financial records from the War Relief Office, with particular attention to discrepancies in the accounts during her tenure as treasurer. The documentation, painstakingly recreated from Victoria's investigation, demonstrated systematic manipulation of charitable funds through methods both ingenious and deplorable. "These figures," Mrs. Price Ridley began with forced composure, "appear to contain certain irregularities that require explanation. One must remember that wartime accounting was necessarily less precise than peacetime standards might demand." Miss Marple's gentle smile conveyed understanding tinged with steel. "Mrs. Carmichael was most thorough in her research, Mrs. Price Ridley. She seemed particularly interested in how charitable funds intended for war widows came to be invested in property that subsequently appreciated so remarkably in value." Miss Hartnell's packet revealed her dual role in the conspiracy, documenting both her administrative manipulation of beneficiary records and her medical expertise in matters that had proved relevant to the elimination of inconvenient investigators. The evidence painted a portrait of systematic deception spanning decades, maintained through methods both subtle and ruthless. "This is preposterous," Miss Hartnell declared, with the sharp authority of one accustomed to intimidating opposition. The woman was clearly deranged, concocting elaborate fantasies to explain her own failures and disappointments. No rational person would credit such wild accusations. Miss Marple's response carried that particular quality of gentle inexorability that had characterized many previous revelations. "Perhaps, Miss Hartnell, though Mrs. Carmichael's research included rather detailed documentation of your botanical studies and your particular expertise in exotic plant preparations. Quite fascinating reading, particularly the sections dealing with alkaloid extraction and concentration methods." Mrs. Weatherby's envelope contained the most personally damaging revelations, detailing her role in creating and maintaining the fictitious beneficiaries who had served as conduits for stolen charitable funds. The documentation revealed not only the systematic nature of the fraud, but also the personal benefits she had derived from her participation in the conspiracy. At this revelation, Mrs. Weatherby's fragile composure finally shattered completely. "It wasn't supposed to continue for so long," she sobbed, abandoning any pretense of innocence. "We told ourselves it was temporary, just until the war ended and we could make proper restitution. But somehow the opportunity never arose, and then years passed, and it became impossible to confess without destroying everything we had built." Miss Marple allowed the confession to proceed uninterrupted, understanding that truth, once released, often flows with the inevitability of water finding its natural course. Mrs. Weatherby's revelations confirmed the systematic nature of the conspiracy and its evolution from wartime opportunism to decades-long criminal enterprise. "Colonel Ashworth was so close to exposing everything," Mrs. Weatherby continued through her tears. "His investigation was comprehensive, methodical, absolutely devastating to our reputations and freedom. When he died so suddenly, it seemed like divine intervention." Miss Marple's voice carried that gentle authority which had guided many previous revelations toward their natural conclusion. "But divine intervention, Mrs. Weatherby, rarely involves exotic plant poisons administered by individuals with medical training and botanical expertise. The silence that followed this observation was profound, broken only by the gentle ticking of the hall clock and the barely audible sound of Mrs. Weatherby's continued sobbing. Miss Marple continued with that methodical precision that had characterized her approach to this most complex of village mysteries. Mrs. Carmichael's investigation revealed that Colonel Ashworth's death was not natural, despite official conclusions to the contrary. The symptoms recorded by Dr. Morrison were consistent with alkaloid poisoning, administered by someone with intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the preparation of exotic toxins. Miss Hartnell's composure, maintained through decades of careful deception, finally began to crack under the weight of accumulating evidence. "You cannot prove such wild accusations," she declared, though her voice lacked its customary authority. "The man died of natural causes 29 years ago, and any suggestion otherwise is merely speculation based on incomplete records." Miss Marple's response carried the quiet certainty of one who had spent considerable time and effort in pursuit of long-delayed justice. "Mrs. Carmichael's investigation was remarkably thorough, Miss Hartnell. She had recreated not only the evidence of financial fraud, but also the proof of murder, including detailed analysis of the methods employed and the expertise required for their successful execution." The revelation that followed proceeded with the methodical precision of a carefully constructed case presented before an invisible jury. Miss Marple detailed the systematic elimination of threats to the conspiracy, beginning with Colonel Ashworth's murder in 1946 and culminating in Victoria's death exactly 29 years later. The same methods, the same expertise, the same ruthless determination to protect secrets that had enriched their keeper for decades, Miss Marple observed with that gentle finality that had concluded many previous investigations. "Miss Hartnell, your medical training provided both the knowledge to prepare exotic poisons and the skill to administer them without detection." At this direct accusation, Miss Hartnell's carefully maintained facade finally collapsed entirely. Her attempt to seize a knitting needle as an improvised weapon was swift but ultimately futile, as Inspector Slack emerged from concealment with the practiced efficiency of long experience in such dramatic conclusions. Chapter 9. Unraveling the Truth. The immediate aftermath of Miss Hartnell's arrest possessed that peculiar quality of anticlimax, which often follows moments of high drama, rather like the settling of dust after a sudden gust of wind has disturbed the careful arrangement of familiar objects. Miss Marple remained in the village hall as Inspector Slack attended to the necessary formalities, her gentle presence providing a curious sort of comfort to those whose world had been so thoroughly upended by the evening's revelations. Mrs. Weatherby, having collapsed entirely under the weight of her confessions, was attended by Dr. Haydock with that professional kindness which medical men reserve for those whose suffering extends beyond the merely physical. Her decades of concealed guilt had finally found release, though at a cost that would shadow her remaining years, with consequences both legal and personal. Mrs. Price Ridley, faced with irrefutable evidence of her leadership role in the conspiracy, had maintained a dignified silence that spoke more eloquently than any protestations of innocence might have done. Her position as the organizing intelligence behind the fraud was undeniable, though her lack of direct involvement in the murders would likely spare her the ultimate penalty that awaited Miss Hartnell. Inspector Slack, having completed the immediate requirements of justice, settled into one of the village hall chairs with the weary satisfaction of a man whose long patience had finally been rewarded. His gratitude toward Miss Marple was evident in his willingness to listen as she explained the reasoning that had guided her investigation from its earliest stages. "The key, Inspector, lay in understanding that we were dealing not with a single crime, but with a pattern of behavior extending across decades," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying that gentle authority which had characterized so many previous explanations. Miss Hartnell possessed both the medical knowledge to prepare exotic poisons and the ruthless determination to employ them in defense of her secrets. Dr. Haydock, having ensured Mrs. Weatherby's immediate welfare, joined their informal conference with the fascination of one whose professional expertise had contributed to the solution. The botanical knowledge required for such preparations is quite specialized, Miss Marple. One would need considerable training in both the cultivation and processing of exotic plant materials. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Indeed, Doctor. Miss Hartnell's wartime service included botanical research for medical applications, providing her with precisely the expertise needed for her subsequent criminal activities. Her position at the War Relief Office gave her access to the funds, while her medical background provided the means to eliminate those who threatened exposure. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with obvious satisfaction. The pattern becomes clear when viewed in proper sequence. Colonel Ashworth's investigation threatened the entire conspiracy, so Miss Hartnell eliminated him using methods that appeared to indicate natural death. 29 years later, when his daughter recreated his evidence, she employed identical techniques to silence this new threat. The psychological dimensions of the case proved as fascinating as its criminal aspects. Miss Marple's analysis revealed how the conspirators had rationalized their initial theft as temporary borrowing necessitated by wartime hardship, only to find themselves trapped in an escalating web of deception that eventually demanded murder to maintain. The transition from financial fraud to homicide represents a classic progression, Miss Marple observed, with that gentle perceptiveness which had illuminated so many human mysteries. Once individuals have compromised their moral foundations sufficiently to steal from war widows, the step to murder becomes merely a matter of practical necessity rather than ethical consideration. Mrs. Bantry, who had remained throughout these proceedings with the bewildered loyalty of genuine friendship, finally found her voice to express the questions that troubled her most deeply. But Jane, how could we have known? They seemed such ordinary people, respected members of our community. Miss Marple's response carried that tone of gentle instruction which she employed when explaining the more troubling aspects of human nature. My dear Dolly, respectability is often the most effective disguise for criminal behavior. People who appear entirely conventional in their daily lives may harbor secrets that would shock those who know them best. The conversation naturally turned to the methods Miss Hartnell had employed to maintain her deception across such an extended period. Her careful cultivation of a reputation for propriety and service had provided perfect camouflage for activities that represented the antithesis of everything she appeared to represent. The irony, Inspector, is that Miss Hartnell's apparent dedication to charitable works actually facilitated her criminal activities, Miss Marple explained. Her involvement in various organizations provided both cover for her botanical research and opportunities to observe potential victims whose curiosity might prove dangerous. Dr. Haydock's professional interest was engaged by the technical aspects of the murders. The exotic poisons she employed were chosen with considerable cunning, Miss Marple. They produced symptoms that could be mistaken for natural death, particularly in an era when forensic analysis was less sophisticated than current methods. Inspector Slack's investigation had already begun to reveal the full scope of the conspiracy's financial impact. The stolen funds, carefully invested over decades, had provided the conspirators with comfortable lifestyles built upon the suffering of those they had been sworn to assist. The mathematics are rather sobering, Inspector Slack reported. The original theft represented a substantial sum, but its investment and reinvestment over 29 years had created considerable wealth. Miss Hartnell alone appears to have derived an income equivalent to a professional salary from her share of the proceeds. Miss Marple's reflection upon these revelations carried that philosophical quality which often marked her consideration of human folly. The true tragedy, Inspector, lies not merely in the crimes themselves, but in their complete unnecessity. All three conspirators possessed sufficient intelligence and capability to have achieved comfortable circumstances through honest endeavour. The evening advanced with a continued discussion of the case's implications, both for the individuals involved and for the community, that must now confront the reality of decades-long deception within its midst. The revelation that respected members of society had systematically defrauded charitable institutions while maintaining facades of respectability struck at the very foundations of social trust. Mrs. Bantry's distress was evident in her repeated questions about how such deception could have remained undetected for so long. Miss Marple's patient explanations gradually illuminated the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy and the skill with which it had been concealed. The beauty of their method, Dolly, lay in its apparent respectability, Miss Marple observed. By maintaining their positions in charitable organizations, they could monitor any potential threats to their security while simultaneously reinforcing their reputations as pillars of the community. Inspector Slack's preliminary investigations had already begun to uncover additional evidence of the conspiracy's scope. Bank records, property transactions, and investment documents painted a comprehensive picture of systematic fraud maintained through methods both ingenious and morally reprehensible. The paperwork alone will require months to analyze completely, Inspector Slack admitted, but the evidence Mrs. Ashworth compiled provides an excellent foundation for recovering the stolen funds and ensuring appropriate penalties for all parties involved. As the evening drew toward its close, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the patience and dedication that Victoria Ashworth had demonstrated in her pursuit of justice for her father and for the countless victims of the conspiracy. Her infiltration of the knitting circle had been a masterpiece of investigative planning, requiring both considerable courage and unwavering determination. She knew the risks involved, of course, Miss Marple observed with quiet admiration. But she also understood that some injustices are too profound to be allowed to remain unaddressed, regardless of the personal cost involved in seeking redress. Chapter 10. Justice Served with Scones. The autumn afternoon that found Miss Marple once again arranging chairs in the village hall carried with it that peculiar quality of renewal which often follows the resolution of long-standing difficulties. 6 weeks had passed since the dramatic conclusion of what the newspapers had termed the Knitting Circle murder case, and St. Mary Mead had begun the gradual process of healing the wounds inflicted by such profound betrayal within its midst. The new Knitting Circle bore little resemblance to its predecessor, save for the gentle clicking of needles